Hey, welcome back, students. So glad that you are here and that you have been assigned The Great Gatsby. Such a great book, in my opinion. I know there's a lot of mixed feelings about it, but here we are. You've been assigned it, and might as well try to get the most out of it. And so, in this video series, I'll try to walk through all the chapters and talk about some of the significant, important events as well as character development throughout the book. And it's important to note to start that I just love Fitzgerald. I think he is a phenomenal writer. I love the imagery, the themes, the metaphors that he presents. And a lot of the story itself, the book itself, revolves around his own personal journey and things that have occurred in his life. And if you haven't read up or learned about his relationship, complex, challenging, tragic, romantic relationship with his wife Zelda, I think it's important to do so because so much of his experience with his relationship with her comes out in The Great Gatsby. And there's just so much that we learn from this book about the lost generation, which was a writing artistic movement after after World War I, the Great War. And so much of those themes and how people were experiencing life come out in this book. And that's why I think it's so important to read. So in this video, we'll talk about chapter 1 and talk about the importance of how Fitzgerald sets up his story. There's so many things that he does that helps us understand where he's going and begin some of the themes that will be important as the story progresses. So the title is called The Great Gatsby, and several things to note is the character's name, Gatsby, J. Gatsby, is in the title, and so he's going to be an important character of the story. And it's also called The Great Gatsby. And so already there is some kind of positive feeling towards the character J. Gatsby implied in the title itself. And so that's going to be significant because that's pretty much how the story starts. And so if we talk about chapter 1, it begins with the narrator Nick Carraway. And he basically he talks about himself in the beginning. And if you have this version of the text, that's what I'll be reading through. In page 1, he talks about some advice that his father gave him, which was, whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages you've had. And so Nick, he talks about how he received this advice from his dad, and that made him to be such a non-judgmental person. So he says here that in consequence, also in page 1, in consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of a few veteran bores. Not a few veteran bores. And so he talks about how he's such a non-judgmental person, and so a lot of people are very open to him, vulnerable, and they're willing to share their secrets with him because he's so impartial. And he says that which is kind of interesting to think, because if you open with that statement and say that you are such a non-judgmental person and you're the one saying that, it makes you think, are you really? Are you truly impartial if that's how you view yourself? And so I think that's important to think. But he also understands this. He feels like he's a good character, a good judge of character, very objective, which to me kind of points to an unreliable narrator. Even the story itself, The Great Gatsby, how you already have this kind of proclivity towards a certain character by naming it that way. And then in page 2, in the first full paragraph, he says, after boasting this of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Okay, so he's qualifying it. He's saying, I am non-judgmental, but I will say that I have some kind of partiality. And he says that this partiality is when he had this experience in the East Coast And it was due to a man named Gatsby. It says, only Gatsby, the man who gives his name this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there is something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. So he has this proclivity and just this positive, almost effusive reaction and attitude towards Gatsby. And he says that Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. I mean, I just love the way he writes. I mean, he has such a way with words. Fitzgerald does. But basically, Nick Carraway, the narrator, he's already alluding to some kind of tragedy that will happen, something that preyed on Gatsby, that caused Nick Carraway, to lose hope in men. And so he kind of begins the story by saying that it's not going to be fully a happy ending. And then he talks more about himself. He comes from a very wealthy family in the Midwest. He was part of the war, World War I, which kind of mirrors Fitzgerald's life. And the way that Carraway talks about his return from the war, starting in page 3, he talks about how he was just unsettled. And that's how a lot of people returning from World War I felt. They just felt like they had seen so much, they had experienced so much of their innocence was lost. This was the first time that there was weapons of, what they would consider at the time mass destruction, explosives, rapid firing guns, and just casualties abound that we had never seen before on that scale. And so people from World War I, veterans, return, and they were called the lost generation because they were just searching. They were confused, like life was just so different for them because of what they had experienced. And so Nick was one of those people, and he decides to move east to New York to get into the stock market, to go into stocks and kind of go to Wall Street, pretty much. And this was the Roaring '20s, so the economy was booming, and he wanted to get a taste of finances, so he went out east. And then we learn about the location of where he went. He went to the West Egg in page 5. They talk about the city and the pair of these enormous eggs. And so I provided this little diagram for you guys so you can see what the geography might have looked like. And so he moved to the West Egg, which is that tiny little house you see right there next to Gatsby's mansion. And it's very interesting in page 5. It talks about the West Egg, which was the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. And this is important because it sets up a disparity between West Egg and the East Egg. And people who lived in the West Egg were wealthy, but they were wealthy because of their circumstances. They became wealthy, so we call it new money. Whereas people living in the East Egg, they were born into wealth. They inherited the wealth, and so they're called old money. And there's this kind of like disparity and conflict between the two. The people, especially in the old money, the East Egg, they look down on the West Egg. And they feel like they're frauds. They feel like they're the East Egg people are above, superior to the West Egg because they already had the wealth, and so they look down upon them. And so this is important because then we get introduced to Tom and Daisy Buchanan. And even the name itself, Buchanan, is this kind of old traditional name. Obviously, we had a president named Buchanan, and it implies this generational wealth, this um, legacy cemented in society. And so Tom Buchanan comes from that society, and he's from the East Egg. He comes from old money, and he went to college with Nick Carraway, and so they know each other from that time. And Daisy and Nick are also cousins, so they have a relationship. And it's really interesting when we learn about their relationship in page 6. Tom was this kind of hulky, bulky, manly man. He played football, polo. He was just this like all brawn, no brain type of man. And it's interesting how Nick describes him. In page 6, the towards the middle of page 6, Nick says, I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrevocable football game. And so there's this kind of sense that Tom is living in the past. He remembers his glory days in college, as an athlete, as a stud, and he is constantly in search of some kind of conquest to relive the glory days, so to speak. And so one day, Nick goes to have dinner with, or lunch, a meal with Daisy and Tom. And goodness, I mean, just look at the description of the house. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected. A cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front toward a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open in the warm, windy afternoon. It's just this, holy moly, just an amazing mansion that they live in. And just wealth beyond what we can imagine. And so we get introduced to Tom first. Tom, Nick uses a lot of words like arrogant, fractiousness, gruffy, husky, defiant, harsh. A lot of these type of words, supercilious, such great words to describe Tom and his just gruffness. He's pretty rough around the edges, and later we'll learn is kind of racist too. He talks about how he's reading this book about eradicating colored men. And then we meet Daisy, and Daisy is quite the opposite, just so effeminate, so dainty, so fragile, gentle. And this is how we're introduced in page 8. As he enters the ballroom, he sees a couch, and there's 2 people lying on the couch, and she says once Nick enters the room, I'm paralyzed with happiness. And she had an absurd, charming little laugh. She laughed again as if she said something very witty and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was the way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the bouncing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her in irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. And so she's just this like soft-spoken, calm, quiet, dainty woman. And later also we learned that Jordan Baker is the other woman. She's a pro golfer, and she and Nick kind of create this spark. But Jordan really is like the center of this gossip, and that's part of the culture that's created. And then we get introduced to Gatsby. Nick mentions that he lives next to a man named Gatsby, and then Daisy's ears perk up. I say, Gatsby? What Gatsby? And so from that should be an indicator that there is something between Daisy and Gatsby, and that will be a focal point of the story. And then, as the story continues, as they continue talking, catching up, we learn that that Tom has some mistress potentially in New York. Jordan kind of reveals that, and then I think it's important just to read through the dialogue and get to know their perspective. We learn that Daisy has a daughter, and that there is some kind of unhappiness within their relationship. Um, and so the evening finishes. Nick returns home, and when he returns home, he sees um, Gatsby. He sees his neighbor. He was on the lawn, and Nick was about to go out and say something to Gatsby, but I'll just read the last paragraph. I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arm toward the dark water in a curious way, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away. That might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. And so that's how chapter 1 ends, where he sees Gatsby reaching out to this green light. And that's going to become an important symbol as we continue the story. But just these are some important things to take note of. A lot of it is character development and who Nick is and the way he's telling the story. His relationship to Tom, Daisy, Jordan, and Gatsby. And then this contention between West and East Egg, and Gatsby, his longing for the green light and what that might mean. So next video we'll talk about chapter 2 and kind of discuss a little bit more about what those themes mean. See you then. And remember to support the channel by clicking the like button and subscribe.